Welcome to The Other Coast, a podcast dedicated to the Malifaux meta in Los Angeles. My name is Jeff, and with me here are two other players in the SoCal area, Jim and Colgan.
Hey guys.
Hey everyone.
Hey, and Jim, welcome back. Colgan and I missed you last time without your restraining influence, so we recorded like a 90-minute episode or something. So please help keep us on task.
We'll see what we can do.
Yeah, we're gonna make it actually pretty challenging for you this time because our topic today is damage.
Oh boy.
Yeah, it's we really drilled down and found a highly focused topic. So to start us off, Jim, why don't you explain what damage is as a concept in the game?
So yeah, damage. Easiest way to think of damage is most of us are familiar with chess, right? You can take an enemy piece off the board by claiming it. That model in Malifaux terms would have one hit point, and the model attacking it, or just the model that's taking it off the board. So at its core, damage is the mechanism by which you can interact with your opponent and remove their pieces from the board.
Got it. So now, Colgan, we've mentioned a couple times on the channel that Malifaux is not about killing stuff, it's about scoring victory points and winning the game, and we've in fact even emphasized that it's possible, although I would imagine quite difficult, to win the game with no remaining models. So does that mean damage is kind of a secondary concept? How important is damage?
I mean, we do say that you can win without fighting a lot, but, it's going to depend on your strategy and schemes. I think it's going to be pretty hard to, beat someone in public enemies if you're not attacking their models at all or forcing them to drop any of those tokens. So, while there are definitely alternative ways of playing, and you could probably run into one of those fighter strategies and still win without killing any of your enemy's models, it's definitely making the game a bit harder for you. I think the main thing to keep in mind is that, damaging or removing models is always going to be an option, but it's not necessarily the best option for what you're trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. So what I'll see with a lot of new players, they're coming from other war games, they just want to pile in the middle, scrum, and try and kill as many people as they can. So they're spending 2 to 3 turns just trying to wipe out the models I just sat in the middle to kind of pull aggro, while I'm going on the side scoring all the points that I need to score. And by the end of the game, it's okay, sure, you killed half my guys, but you don't have anything to show for it.
Right.
Yeah, and part of that I think is, look at the scoring mechanics and how you earn victory points in those other games. In Magic the Gathering, the entire point is to drop your enemy's hit points to 0 by damage. In War Machine and Hordes, you automatically win regardless of scenario if you take out the enemy caster. In Warhammer, it's gotten better, but even in Warhammer, if your opponent has no models on the table, you win the game by default.
Right.
So damage in those games is the default win condition. So it makes sense to play those games and tailor those games to doing damage. In Malifaux, the fact of the matter is that is not your default win condition. Mm-hmm. So I think when we say that you can win Malifaux without throwing a single attack, that's because it's not the default win condition. But I agree with Colgan 100%. You are going to make it so much harder on yourself if you don't incorporate some amount of attacks into your gameplay.
Right.
Another thing to think about is attacks are opposed duels, which inherently means you're interacting with your opponent. The most interaction in the rules, at least as far as the rulebook is concerned, comes during these opposed duels and these attack actions. So in a sense, it's a lot more fun if you're able to trade some blows with your opponent, because then you're both doing things, and it's not just moving pieces on the board against each other.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
I just want to also put it out there, even though we do say it's you can win without attacking your opponent, that's still more or less going to be the default thing that happens in the game. You're going to be killing your opponent's pieces. You're going to be fighting them. It's not whenever the three of us play, we're at this higher tier of ascendancy where we're just we don't need to even interact with the other person. And it's we just read out the game to its finish without ever getting into scrums or fighting like that. It's just to keep the idea that I think in Malifaux it's all about being able to evaluate your options and understand what is going to be the most, or I guess the best action to take at any given time. Mm-hmm. And it's just like telling new players that you don't always want to think about attacking or removing your opponent's pieces, because sometimes, again, like that can actually work against what you're trying to accomplish depending on the strategy and the schemes you've selected.
Right. I think it's worth pointing out because, and I could be mistaken, but a lot of times it seems like there's this perception that if you're playing a one of the more combative crews, that you're somehow playing Malifaux at a lesser level than if you're playing one of the crews that relies on like scheming or summoning or has somewhat convoluted mechanics. And I don't think that that's true at all. I think even though it is possible to win a game of Malifaux with crews that have a lower damage potential, these conflict-centered crews, these crews that want to be fighting and doing damage, they're not necessarily any easier to play or to win with than any other.
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of people tell themselves to make themselves feel better when they get their asses kicked. Like, I think if you're going to be like, oh, I only lost because my crew's harder to play, it's like, okay, well, you suck at playing them too. So it's like, it always sounds like an excuse to me. It's like, okay, you lost. Like, these are both valid crews to play. Just because one is fightier and you weren't able to effectively counteract them doesn't make you still somehow the better player in this.
Right. Now, for our listeners who stuck with us thus far, please go back to the previous episodes where Colgan talks about how he's such a hero for coming up in the game with Nelly.
I never said that. You said that about me. I just did not deny it.
That sounds like fake news to me. Bringing us back to what we're talking about here, which is damage. There's a couple of ways in Malifaux that you do damage. We talked about attack actions, but there's also these pulse damage sources and shock waves. So there's a variety of ways to apply that damage to your enemy. And the way I like to put it, as Colgan mentioned, is this the right play for me? It's a tool in your toolbox for scoring points. If you have the option to take an attack or an interact, the question I ask myself is, does this score me points? Or if it doesn't, does this deny me points? I need to ask myself that one more often, because I have more often than I care to admit been like firmly sitting on 7 victory points and then run my dude off the marker that he needs to sit on to protect it, or go kill something and then go, oh wait, I just denied myself 2 points because I wanted to kill something.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it seems to me that damaging attacks serve a couple different purposes, right? I mean, it is possible for there to be ways to score victory points through damaging or killing models. Some of the schemes, some of the strategies, they are based on that kind of interaction. And then, of course, if you can remove an enemy model, you can prevent the enemy from using it to score. But a really important concept, which I think we should at least touch on, is that when you remove a model, it helps you acquire what people sometimes refer to as activation control. Mm-hmm. So, Colgan, I guess for our listeners who maybe aren't so familiar with the concept or haven't really thought about it, how would you explain, activation control?
Yeah, we touched on it a little bit on our episode about resources, but activation control is just basically being able to control, well, how I see it is you can kind of control pressure where action is taking place on the board. So if you have activation control, you can have it so you're taking the last action in a turn, or you're able to take actions that the opponent isn't able to immediately respond to. Mm-hmm. And if you have more models, you can kind of control it so maybe you take the last activation in turn and you kind of drop that last scheme marker where the opponent could have easily removed it if they still had 1 or 2 models left to go. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of ways to kind of create activation pressure. One of the easiest ways is, just removing the opponent's models, but even just wounding them or getting them really low on health. Now the opponent has to be well, if I don't activate this guy, there's a good chance he's going to die before he can do anything. So he might activate him to get those last few actions out, even though it's not, a very useful activation for them, but it's better than nothing.
Right. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So I guess now we should maybe dig into some specifics, right? So when you talk about damage, I think, kind of like Jim mentioned earlier, there are direct damaging attacks. This is an attack where one model maybe shoots another, uses a melee attack against another, and it does, it's damage principally only to that target, right? It's just a direct infliction of damage. And then there are indirect damage sources, and these can be shockwaves, which are kind of like these area effect. Generally, you might think of them as like a grenade or a fireball or something like that. There's also some effects in the game that maybe, for instance, Leviticus's aura, if you activate near him, you take damage. I tend to think of them as more indirect, even though it is damage from one model to another. It's not coming from a direct attack.
Mm-hmm.
So when we evaluate these direct attacks, one of the most important components is the damage track, and it'll generally be three numbers, something like 2, 3, 4, and for those of you maybe who aren't super familiar with the way Malifaux works, if you flip a weak card for damage, you do the first, a moderate is a second, and the severe, you get to do the third number on the slash, which is almost always the highest value. So Jim, now that we've kind of explained damage tracks, I assume there's variation in damage tracks, because there do seem to be a lot of variation in Malifaux generally. So how do you evaluate a damage track?
Well, that's the beauty of the game. So the damage track, damage profiles, when you look at them at first, it seems like, okay, maybe you think a third of the time I'll do weak, a third of the time I'll do moderate, a third of the time I'll do severe. And that's just not true. Because the damage tracks themselves, you can look at them in a vacuum, but I think it's best to look at them with the concept of the accuracy modifier before talking about the actual numbers.
Right, and so the accuracy modifier, you derive that from the range of success, right? How much the attacker has won the duel against a defender.
Correct, and that's a mechanic unique to Malifaux. Other games just have binary, you hit, you cause the damage. And if it's not saved, it causes the damage. For Malifaux, when you hit, it's how well do you hit? There is a number of conditions and abilities that provide positive and negative twists to this flip, but at its fundamental source, you have to beat your opponent in an opposed duel by between 6 and 10 to have no native modifier to the attack flip. Most people, when you look at the stats, have defensive values and offensive values in the 4 to 6 range. Many models will have, between 4 and 6 defense or willpower, and then a 4 or 6 on their attack stat. What this means is that it's really unlikely for you to be beating someone by more than 6 on a given attack.
Mm-hmm.
So that means you're often going to have a beat them by 1 to 5, which puts you into this negative damage flip territory, and all other things being, not taking any other bonuses into consideration right now. If you're flipping on a negative, core rules of Malifaux says you can't cheat the damage flip. So if you're flipping 2 cards, picking the lowest, and you look at how many cards that are weak are in a 52 card deck, are moderate in a 52 card deck, or severe in a 52 card deck, someone's done the numbers somewhere, but there's quick mental math, about 20 weak cards, 20 moderate cards, and 16 face cards before you add jokers in. So odds are, when you're doing an attack, you're probably going to hit that weak damage more often than not. So you're likely going to do what's called minimum damage, which is that weak slot. So when you first look at an attack, I look at what the minimum damage is, because I expect my model, all things considered, to be doing minimum damage with an attack.
Right. So then, Colgan, that's like this min 2, min 3 concept that, we might see people talk about on the forums or a weird place, right?
Oh yeah, that's a pretty common shorthand, just the minimum damage track on a model. So you say min 2 or min 3, and that's why a lot of people consider like the baseline for some of your more aggressive or beater models to be min 3, because then you have a reliable source of damage.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And now I do recall that we had talked about this previously, but since it's pertinent to the subject and it's not going to take too long, why don't we go over it again? So does this mean that if you're taking a model to be a beater, to do a damage dealer, you would only ever take a model that were, min 3?
Yeah, I mean, of course it's going to depend. There's a lot of things that will make a card good for, I guess, being like an assassin and trying to move enemy pieces. Like they might have some abilities that make it more reliable, and their damage track for the moderate and severe might be good enough that you also want to use them to try and move models. Another common damage track is like 245, which is still respectable. And if you're able to make sure that you're consistently getting like straight flips on the damage, so you have a good chance at hitting those moderate severes, then they can definitely be used as one of your main fighters or your main beater in your crew. All this is all going to depend on the keyword you're taking, what kind of defensive tech the opponent has, because there's some models, they'll have like a 2, 3, 4 damage track, which is normally considered really low. But if they have the ability to ignore defensive tech like armored or shielded, then they might be worth taking against certain masters.
Right. So, I guess what I'm hearing is that, you can't just look at the damage track to really get a sense of what the model's minimum damage is going to be, because it's a much more holistic process. What can your model do? What can your opponent's model do? But it is important to understand what your model's reliable min damage is, because that's going to provide the baseline for calculating how many activations it'll take one model or one damage track to kill a specific enemy model, right?
Right. Or, if you're banking on those moderate and severe damage tracks, you want to make sure that you're actually setting up for the attack for that one model, making sure you have the cards in your hand to actually cheat in that high damage, or have some way to ensure that you're going to be able to get like straight or plus flips when you're flipping for damage.
Right. Sure. So, that makes sense. So, let's move on from minimum damage then, and let's talk about spike damage. Let's talk about, attacks that have a really high, moderate and severe, and sort of the 245 like you mentioned, or 346. Are these spike damage things, are they just due to luck? Like, oh geez, I flipped really well and you flipped badly, now I can do a ton of damage, or is there more deliberate process for pulling these off?
I think there's a bit of a deliberate process there, because a lot of the models with these spiky damage tracks, I actually do this mental calculation in shorthand, and I think it's helpful. When you look at an attack, if you do 2 attacks at a minimum, is that equal to or better than 1 attack at severe? Because if you're trying to if this is a game of activations and every action you take with your models is precious, then you want to get the best bang for your buck, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I have, let's say I have a Bayou Bushwhacker. They have a trusty rifle, which is a 14-inch weapon with a 235 damage track. So if I shoot twice and I hit and get that negative damage twist, I'm going to do 2 plus 2 damage in the best of worlds, and do for minimum, and do 4 damage. If I hit once at severe, I'm doing more than 2 attacks with minimum. And this is where we talk about the condition known as focus. And focus is, I think, one of the most powerful conditions in 3rd edition as it is right now. Because as of the time of the recording, focused provides a positive twist to attack flips and a positive twist to damage flips on ensuing a hit. Why this is relevant is that if you hit somebody by 1 to 5, your accuracy modifier is that negative twist that we talked about just a few moments ago. Now, if you use that attack with focus, A, you're more likely to beat somebody by 1 to 5 because you're flipping 2 cards to their 1. And B, if you hit and you beat them by 1 to 5, suddenly you're bumped back to a straight damage flip. And now you can go ahead and take that severe card in hand and boom, do 5 damage.
Right. And, focus as a mechanic, I frequently see it being used to get around defensive tech, right? So someone might focus in, if their target has, say, manipulative, which would normally give a minus on the attack, they focus to cancel that, and so it might seem that the primary use for this focus is to make the attack land. But then actually, if the focus also pushes your negative flip on damage into a straight flip, that then provides you the cheating capability that you mentioned. And, as someone who plays Colette, I have these 5-stone showgirls who have manipulative, and that's their defense tech, right? And so when people focus against them and then they hit them, they only have 5 health. So a severe 5 is not an uncommon amount on models. and so manipulative in it almost feels like it works against the model, having it, because it's almost like, well, it forced the attacker into a situation that is now just going to lead to the model getting removed. So is it even good defense? Anyways, that's how I feel like when I get the model removed. But so Colgan, when would you really be looking to do these sort of spiky hits that Jim's talking about?
As Jim mentioned, if you're going to be using this focus, it's going to take, an extra action to set up that attack. So if you're ever looking, or if I'm ever looking for these spiky damage tracks, it's when I think it'll allow me to get a kill on a model, and I'm going to be engineering the rest of my turn kind of making that as likely as possible. So when I go into that attack, I want to make sure that I can ensure that I hit and that I still have a card left over for the damage if needed. Of course, if I go into it and I'm able just to flip everything I need, that's great for me. But focusing and then either missing or getting the hit and flipping a weak and not being able to cheat it to any better doesn't feel great. Like even when you have these spiky damage tracks, like, okay, yeah, sure, 2 minimum damage hits isn't as good as a severe, but if you have no way of ensuring that severe hit, then I feel like it's better just to go for the volume of attacks, because you can burn cards out of your opponent's deck or maybe force them to cheat into something out of their hand without you having to expend resources.
Right. Well, and some attacks also get some of their damage through triggers, right? If, for instance, if a model has a critical strike trigger, that might be a model that is better off taking multiple attacks.
Like we always say, it's really going to depend. But when I first started playing, and after I lived through or did not live through a few focus attacks, I was like, I should just focus for every attack. Like, why wouldn't I? But then after playing more, it's like it is a lot of resources to throw into something. And if you aren't able to kind of like make sure you're getting something back out of it, your model just did nothing for that entire turn. They focused and then they whiffed.
Right.
Yeah. And on that note, there's something really important in what you just said, which is it costs you resources. It's a riskier but has a higher potential payoff to take focused attacks on something than it is to do the volume of attacks. Because most people have a 6-card hand. If you're dedicating 1 severe in your hand to the damage and probably dedicating another severe to ensure that hit goes, a third of your hand is dedicated, an entire activation usually of your model is dedicated to trying to remove an enemy model. If that whiffs, yeah, you are definitely down in the activation game.
Sure.
The other thing to keep in mind in this mental calculus we're talking about is the actual attack stat that you're working with. Malifaux is a game where there's small number differences make a big deal. Most models have a defensive stat, either defense or willpower, in that 4 to 6 range. More often than not, 5 to 6, and an attack stat in a 5 to 6. Whenever you're making an attack with a stat that is equal to or greater than the model you're attacking, you can reliably ensure a hit. Malifaux, the attacker wins ties. So if I'm attack 5 and you're defense 5, if I cheat a 10, you have to cheat an 11 to beat me. So I'm trading a moderate in my hand for a severe out of your hand for you to dodge the hit.
Right.
That gives me better card advantage. But if I am spending an attack 5 stat against your stat 6 model, like say I'm using that 14-inch trusty rifle against someone with defense 6, suddenly not only do I have to be 1 card higher, 1 value higher on you with my card just to beat you, I can't ensure that attack goes through. You could theoretically have the 1 card to just deny me. And suddenly, yeah, I might be getting a severe out of your hand, but you have negated an entire model's activation. When it comes down to making your attack, I think I value an attack stat of 6 on my beaters more than necessarily the damage track. Because if I can consistently put the damage on something, that's still getting me return on my investment of actions.
I can see that.
Yeah. I just wanted to chime in on that. Like, as I've been playing more, I've been putting a lot more value on the stat as well. And for me, one of the big reasons is if you have a higher attack stat, like if you have 6 to the opponent's defense of 5, it also increases the chance that the opponent has to cheat first. So you're not in any danger of losing a card cheating in when the opponent has a higher card to beat you out. So like say maybe the highest card you have is like a 10, you win the flip and then they cheat in a 13. If you lost the flip and you had to cheat in first, then you're just losing out that card, and then you're basically reducing your accuracy for the rest of the turn, and it makes any attack actions later in the turn a lot riskier because you no longer have that higher card to cheat in to possibly win those duels.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, and what it sounds like, and this is a pretty common refrain on the other coast, but it really sounds like both of you, Jim and Colgan, you're really evaluating these actions, in terms of resources, right? And resource expenditure, especially. You're talking about cheating for damage, or cheating, and then if your opponent has to cheat and you can cheat in a better card to win, they've just had to expend a resource for no value. So I guess what I'm asking is that is this kind of efficiency your primary concern when you're evaluating these attack actions?
For me it's definitely something that I'm always thinking about. I was saying earlier, Malifaux is all about options and trying to take like the best path towards scoring as many points as possible. So if I'm making an attack, I already have an idea of like what I'm expecting out of it. There's like some weaker minions, they'll have like ranged attack actions, which may be like 1, 2, or 3 damage, but I still like having those because, sometimes when I'm moving up the board, if I don't want to overcommit, I can just kind of throw it out and just like start, softening up an enemy without actually having to fully commit myself to one part of the board or a certain course of action before like the rest of the models have already deployed. Like conversely, if I'm going in for a kill, I want to make sure that I have those cards in hand so that I'm not just basically putting my guy out there and just leaving him out to dry because I'm not able to do any damage. I'm not able to remove a model, and then he's like completely exposed and by himself.
Rip Paul Crockett. But actually, I wanted to say something here, Colgan. You have been playing a little bit of Hamlin lately, and one of the things I find the most frustrating are your totems and their stat 4 attack. Because while a stat 6 is a good attack for making sure a hit happens, if I'm defending against a stat 4 and you hit me, it feels really bad to have to choose whether or not to cheat against a stat 4 attack. Because then it feels almost like I have to spend a card on an attack that shouldn't have hit in the first place.
Right, that's another thing. The totems are stat 5 on their barf attack, and their vomiting disease is the stat 5 against willpower, and then their flail is a stat 3 on the attack. But that's another thing to consider too. It's like what I love about Hamlin, the totems, like they have a 1-3-4 damage track, but like it puts the opponent at pause because okay, yeah, sure, I'm unlikely to get that 1 damage, but if I get in that 3 damage, it's like the equivalent of a beater model. And for me, I have 3 of these guys, and like if they hit, it's like a bonus to me, right? Like I get 3 of them for free. Like their attack's pretty decent, but it's just like extra pressure on the opponent because it's like, do I really want to cheat in against this like little 2-point totem that's just walking around? Like it can't really score me points. So their primary function for me is to either like jam up the enemy, or like once I start stacking blight, I'm fairly convincingly put out like a threat of 3 or 4 damage from one of these like little walking barf bags that I have on the table. And it's just great because like it feels like a no-win situation for my opponent.
Right. So how do you guys kind of evaluate and in before it depends. How do you guys kind of evaluate these models that maybe Hinomatsu is a good example. Her damage profile isn't really that impressive. She's min 2, but she's got this onslaught trigger to get more attacks. How do you evaluate that against maybe someone like Elijah Borgman who's got this huge great sword? When when you're looking to hire, are there particular matchups where multiple attacks are preferable to a big swing, or vice versa, or like are there particular situations where you want one over the other, or is it basically just they got what they got?
I think generally I'm in favor of having more attacks, because while yes, I made this whole deal about the fact that you're probably going to do min damage, the more attacks you take, the more likely you are to be pleasantly surprised with those moderate or severe results. Also, one of the things that Hinomatsu has going for her, and Elijah may not, is... Actually, remind me, I don't have the app up. is Hinamatsu nimble?
Let me check. I don't think so.
Because one of the things that's important with a beater in particular is how many times can they swing that sword?
She's not nimble, but she has flurry, which is what makes her really scary.
Yeah, she got flurry and onslaught, and her attack has a built-in plus flip. So
right. So yeah, like for I guess like in Hinamatsu in this case, yeah, the reliability of the action is part of what makes it really scary.
Right. So so for instance, I mean, let's say you're playing Hinamatsu, and let's say that you've really tagged someone. You've hit them by 6 or more, so you're getting that straight flip for damage, but it's not a mask. It won't give you the onslaught trigger. Will you cheat in a mask that will dip you into a negative flip for damage in order to get that additional attack? When would you maybe consider doing that, and when would it be a good idea to keep the straight flip?
So here's the big brain moment. I would have stoned for a mask before I swung, but. But the answer to that question is, am I going to kill the target? So if I'm on a straight flip, I guess what I'm saying is, does the model have hard to kill? Because if I have a solid hit that I know is going to cause damage, that's a known value, and I can control for that and do, force a moderate or severe damage result. But if it's something that has a hard to wound result or a demise trigger where extra damage is lost, like I think in MMOs you have this concept of like overhealing and overdamage, where you can, if you think of enemy wound totals as like a 0 to X value, if you do X plus 3 and you do X plus 0, you still kill the target, but if it costs you more resources to do X plus 3, those are wasted.
Mm-hmm.
So if I know I have hit and I can kill the target, I'm not going to bother cheating for that onslaught. But if I've hit and I know that I'm going to drop it to hard to kill, yeah, I'll cheat for that onslaught because I need that onslaught to kill the target.
What about you, Colgan?
Yeah, more or less the same thing. I think you can you can just kind of evaluate with how we've been saying it earlier. It's like, what do you get the most value out of? If you're like, oh, I can get this onslaught trigger, but if you just like cheated in that moderate for damage, you could kill the guy. It's like, why are you going to cheat it in for the onslaught attack? So it's really kind of about evaluating like, what is this going to accomplish if I cheat it in? Is it worth it? And like, how high is that card? If it's not going to put me really far ahead, if I'm not going to kill the guy, there might be cases where I don't even cheat on that card, because for me, it's just nice to have those cards in hand to cheat in later. And like, well, I already flipped a high card out of my deck. So, it seems to me that I should just kind of roll with it and do the damage if I wasn't already playing to kill the guy. Or it depends on so many factors. Like, yeah, if I don't think I'm going to kill the guy, then I probably won't cheat in. I'll just leave it in for later.
Well, so, for those of you who are playing the Other Coast drinking game at home, you should be feeling pretty tipsy at this point. And we got plenty more It Depends coming up. But let's round out our discussion on damage tracks and kind of talk briefly about cheating damage. And I know we touched on this maybe in a couple other sections, but let's just, really kind of put a cap on it. When would you guys look to cheat your damage flip?
When I can. Mostly because it happens so rarely, and if I have the opportunity to put more damage in, and, kidding aside, I think it's only really worthwhile to cheat damage if you have the opportunity to, and the difference in damage that you're cheating is significant. Let's say I'm playing the Wastrel keyword, and I have Sadir, and he is taking a shot with that 2-3-6 damage track gun. If I can cheat a Severe in, I'll put a Severe in, because that'll do 6 damage to something and probably kill it. Or at least drop it really low and make it more likely to die. But if I only have a moderate in hand, the difference between a 2 and a 3 is just not worth it to me to spend a card out of hand that I could probably use to dodge an attack or make another attack hit later in the turn.
Yeah, so I more or less agree with Jim. Like, it sounds simplistic, but I'll cheat in damage whenever I can. But the thing is, normally when I'm cheating in damage, it's something that I've already planned to do at the beginning of the turn. If it happens that, it's like, oh, I could cheat in damage against this attack that I wasn't really worried about. Like I was mentioning before, if I have like my little scheme runners or my like low cost minions just throwing out ranged attacks, like I won't necessarily cheat in the damage, even if it would take it from like a 2 to like a 4, because it's not something that I'm really worried about hitting, or I might already have that card earmarked for another action later in the turn. So when I'm cheating in damage, like I would say the majority of the time, it's because I already planned to do it at the beginning of the turn. I have this guy in place. I need to remove this model, and I'm dedicating a lot of resources to making sure that model dies.
All right. So I guess let's just finish off this discussion of cheating by talking about the Red Joker. Other than when you're doing demo games with Greg, when would you look to cheat in the Red Joker as damage?
That was against Matt.
Oh, was it against Matt? I'm sorry. Are you sure it didn't happen multiple times? Because I feel like it was against Greg too. But so at any rate, the Red Joker, when you cheat it in, it's going to do severe +1 damage, and it's this really unique capability in the game. But of course, it's also a stat 14 in any suit that you want. So do you guys evaluate the Red Joker specially in terms of cheating it in for damage?
I actually... Colgan, you answer first.
Okay, I will take this then. Honestly, normally when I have the Red Joker in my hand, I am looking at it to cheat in damage, because most of the time, for a lot of the triggers I want, it'll usually be on Henchmen or Masters, and I can burn a stone to make sure I get it, or I have other cards in my hand that can kind of fulfill that condition. Obviously, there are going to be some cases where I don't have the cards in hand, I might not have the stones, or it might be like an enforcer or a minion that I can't actually burn a soul stone to get the suit in, that I will use the Red Joker in order to secure a suit and get an action. But the majority of the time, I'm going to be looking to use it for damage, because I feel like, like having a 14 is great, but most of the time with models that I'm using offensively, their stats usually high enough that a 13 will ensure the hit anyways. So I want to use the Red Joker and get as much value out of it as possible. And it being able to add an extra damage to a hit, taking like severe from like 5 to 6 damage, can definitely put models into a kill range.
Right. And it sounds like the Red Joker in particular, it's effective in cases like Jim mentioned Sadir, right, with a very spiky damage track, where you get a lot more value out of the moderate and the severe than you do from the weak.
Interesting. Because I'm actually going to go ahead and differ a little bit here, just to spice things up. Yes, it is a big deal to get that +1 damage on severe. At the same time, it is only 1 more damage. And I know that sounds crazy, but if I'm not going to kill something with a severe +1 damage flip, knowing that I can secure a hit for 2 or more damage with minimum, that seems to me a little more reliable overall damage. That said, I am not going to complain when I flip the Red Joker on damage flip, and I will absolutely cheat it in damage when I have the opportunity and I think it'll get me close enough to kill that target.
Sure.
But I also know, especially with the way 3rd edition is now, and we'll touch on this in another episode, there's a lot of models out there who can mitigate or undo damage if you give them the opportunity to. And nothing feels worse than taking a focus shot, cheating the Red Joker for damage on somebody, have them live on like 1 or 2 wounds, and then be like, I have Serena Bowman activate and heal me for 6 because she is fair and balanced.
Right. Well, so it sounds like we've, when it comes to damage tracks, we've kind of min damaged that horse to death. So, why don't we shift now to our next topic, and we want to talk about, ping damage, right? And when we say that, we mean, these kind of lower damage, usually 1 or 2 points. They frequently come either for free, like from an aura such as Leviticus, or shockwaves are a common attack action that will deal what people generally consider to be ping damage. Why is ping damage good, or is it good? I mean, maybe it's just bad. What do you guys think about ping damage and its role in the game?
So for me, the great thing about most ping damage is that it's reliable, and I feel like a lot of the times it's a way to just kind of force pressure on the opponent, and it's especially great against like armored crews and stuff like that, because normally they're making your attacks less effective, but now you have a passive way of pulsing out damage that more or less doesn't care about any armor that they have on them. So, these are things like you were mentioning earlier with like Leviticus's aura. I think, is it like unmade or something? I forget what it is. And, there's also some masters that will just like create like hazardous terrain markers and you just drop it under the enemy. And now, like, when they activate, they're taking 1 damage. And it's like, it can also pulse out pressure if you get someone down to like 1 HP. And it's like, well, if they activate, they just die. So now the opponent just kind of has like a dead model on the board that they can't really do anything with, or they have to expend a lot of resources trying to get them out or trying to like save them from their inevitable doom.
Right. Or, I mean, they just have to activate and do nothing, because that is an option as well. But at that point, it's pretty much the same as a dead model, right? So now, Jim, I mean, I know you probably have a better perspective than either of us on ping damage, because Wong is one of the masters in your rotation. So how do you kind of see ping damage and its role in the game?
I mean, Colgan really hit the nail on the head with it's a great tool against armor. Another Bayou master, Ophelia, she has the ability when she attacks, her whole shtick is she's like loaded up with guns like a 90s Punisher comic. And she can plink them, or she shoots and she can discard the upgrade and do 1 damage. So in a sense it makes her damage track +1, but because it's 2 separate instances for things like armor that reduce damage per instance but never below 0, or never below 1, excuse me, it's getting damage through what would otherwise be absorbed. Shockwaves are a different kettle of fish, and the reason for that is, as bad as this sounds, your opponent gets a choice on whether or not they take damage from shockwaves. Aura damage like Leviticus or like Misery from Pandora, it just happens.
Mm-hmm.
That if you meet the qualifications, you have that point of damage.
Right.
With Wong, he's kind enough to ask you, are you willing to fail this simple duel that you could cheat because it's on a straight flip for you? Unless my lovely assistant is nearby, but she's probably going to die if she's nearby you, so more often than not, you're going to be on a straight flip for a simple duel to pass.
So so then are you saying that Wong's attacks are bad that you can avoid them, or is there an upside to your opponent having a say in whether it happens or not?
So shockwaves are one of those player skill style abilities, I feel, and shockwaves are also abilities that get better in volume, because if you do a single shockwave test and you hit 2 models with the shockwave, that's 2 simple tests. That's not a lot of pressure for your opponent to flip a card that they're probably going to be 50% passing just off the flip. If your opponent doesn't spread their crew out and you can tag multiple people with your shockwaves, suddenly you're flipping 3 times, 6 times in 1 action. You're going to start failing, and then your opponent's going to start cheating cards. And you only have so many cards in hand. And as we've been talking, some people like to earmark their cards for specific actions. Where Wong starts to shine for me is if he can throw, 6 shockwaves out in a turn, or 4 to 6, depending on what you do with him, you can start to really hit a bunch of dudes, apply a lot of hand pressure because they're starting to fail, and if they have to choose, do I choose to take 2 damage or do I cheat to pass? That's a lot of decision making on your opponent's part. That's a lot of possible hand pressure. And if they are spending their hand doing that, you still have an entire crew of dudes who, because it's Wong, are probably going to be fast because they got shot in the butt by magic, that have reliable melee attacks. Swine Cursed have a 2-4-5 damage track. The Taxidermist have a 2-3-4 damage track on stat 6 that can reliably hit and do bonus damage with critical strike. So Wong uses shockwaves as hand pressure and buffing his crew. I know you play Colette, and I know that she does shockwaves to debuff the opponent. You have Rasputina is another model that uses shockwaves with her attacks, and those can put out debuff conditions. I think the strength of shockwaves really is the threat of failure can force your opponent to spend resources more so than it is actually doing damage. damage.
I see. And, Colgan, do you kind of see shockwaves in the same way?
Yeah, so for me, shockwaves are more about creating pressure on the opponent. The way I always think about it's like, okay, sure, there might be like a 50-50 chance, but if I'm forcing like 2 or 3 tests and they're flipping like 10s and 11s, those are cards that are no longer in their deck. So if I'm putting out those shockwaves early in the turn, when later I go in and I'm trying to, hit with my models, I'm essentially trading in like a 5 or a 6 for the shockwave to go off for like maybe a couple high cards like 10, 11s and cards like that out of my opponent's deck. So when we go to flip later, the chances of me succeeding on my opposed duels is higher because I still have those cards either in my hand or in my deck, whereas my opponent has burned them to dodge this shockwave attack.
Sure. No, I mean, that makes sense. So I guess, what I'm kind of wondering to kind of fold in our discussion about spiky damage earlier, in terms of killing models, these ping damage effects, do we see crews that just kind of layer so many ping damage effects that they just kind of melt the other crew down over the course of the game? Or are these ping attacks kind of most effective in setting up maybe a big hit because the opponent has cheated out the cards to avoid the shock waves, or the big cards are gone from the deck or whatever? So how do you guys see these? Are they complementary, or are they sort of like different modalities for dealing damage on I guess a crew basis, right? Like maybe crew A is like the kind of slow burn crew, and B is hack you to pieces kind of thing. Is there that dichotomy, or are they more supportive of each other?
That's a good one. I think in our meta, most of the passive damage and like lots of instances of damage are more of the soften people up variety. I don't know anyone in our area that is really playing something that's doing a ton of instances of damage to chop something up right away. Like, we don't have a Nakima player who's coming in with Hey Red and doing minimum 6 damage to things.
Yeah, I guess in our meta, we haven't really seen anyone like just trying to run a crew where they just annihilate you through ping damage. But I always feel like with shockwaves and kind of the aura damage, it's just extra pressure you're applying to your opponent. So maybe you're not necessarily killing things, but them moving into an area where you're able to get all this insured damage off and soften them up and have the threat of killing them, kind of, it creates these areas of control that your opponent doesn't really want to step into. So it gives you a lot more freedom with how you operate during the course of the game. It gives you control over certain sections of the board, even if you're not like actively removing models from your opponent.
Right. So, what I'm hearing is that one of the virtues of these ping damage is, and actually, Colgan, I think you said this explicitly, is its reliability in the sense that it doesn't take as much for you, the attacker, to produce these effects, right? So, generally, we're not talking about opposed duels where your opponent can resist it. If it's a ping damage aura, it's typically something that you just have. If it's a shockwave, it's going to be a simple duel. And so the fact that you have total control over whether it happens or not, or at least a lot more control over whether it happens or not, compared to a direct damaging attack, means that you can calculate whether it's going to happen to a higher degree of reliability. And then since we're talking about these damage attacks, like, oh, well, how many attacks is it going to take to kill this guy? Every variable you can replace with a known factor is going to make your calculations more precise. And the sense I'm getting is that the more precise your calculations, or the more accurate your calculations are borne out on the table, the more likely you're going to achieve what you're trying to achieve. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, there's a lot of times too with like shockwave attacks, like I'll toss them out just to create that hand pressure, and maybe the opponent doesn't have the cards in the hand, and it brings one of the guys low enough that I'm like, oh, I can actually just remove them off the board without actually expending a lot of effort, and I'll go ahead and change my plan because I can now remove this model, just by taking up like one activation or one attack, whereas before I wouldn't have dedicated those resources because there's so many unknowns following that course of action.
The less uncertainty you have is the better, in my opinion. I think that's kind of a non-controversial statement. Like in dice-based games, you can go with the law of averages to make your predictions, and sometimes you roll hot and sometimes you roll cold. Sometimes you flip hot, sometimes you flip cold. But I think Malifaux does provide a number of tools, both for you and your opponent, to manipulate fate, as it were, in your favor.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. So, I mean, I think we've done a pretty good job of covering damage as a concept. You know, I realize a lot of these, you know, these ideas, they're not profound ones, right? It's not like we're cracking the Da Vinci Code here, or the unified, you know, the unified field theory. It's something that probably anyone could work out if they really stopped to think about it. But I think a lot of newer players maybe don't appreciate at first the implications of damage, right? So you might see someone cheat in damage flips regardless of how much value they're really getting for it, or frequently I see new players struggle to really assess how valuable it's going to be to have an aura that does 1 damage to people. It doesn't seem maybe as dramatic as a greatsword hit for 6, but on the table it can have just as much impact in the right situation. So I think that's pretty much it for us tonight. If you listened and you want to let us know what you think, we would love to hear from you. We play in Los Angeles, but we want to be part of the wider Malifaux discussion, and that's part of why we're doing this podcast. So if you have any feedback, whether you think our show is great, whether you think it's terrible, somewhere in between, whether you think what we said is stupid, whether you agree with us, let us know, because we would love to hear from other Malifaux players. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can leave us a like, a comment, a subscribe. All those are really appreciated. We also have a Patreon and a PayPal, and the links will be in the show notes. So if you want to support the channel that way, obviously that would be super cool.